Good afternoon, my name is Olha Atamanova and I want to thank everybody who joins us both online and in this studio. Ukraine Media Center Confirm continues its operation. It's been 9 years of the war and today is day 391 of the full-scale invasion of our homeland by Russian aggressor, and now we will be talking about an interesting subject that is discussed very vividly by our journalists and our society. Joining us online is Yurii, Poita, head of the Asia-Pacific section at the Center for Army Conversion and Disarmament Studies. Mr. Yurii, good afternoon. Good afternoon. Good afternoon. The subject that is being discussed now by many, the topic of Xi Jinping's trip to Moscow, is still going on, and we've seen some official statements about that trip already. So what's going on over there? To what extent can we understand what are the negotiations about and what does it imply for Ukraine? Well, obviously, it's very difficult to analyze so far because we have too little information for analysis for the time being. We don't see any signed documents. It's been only 2 articles published, one by Russian president and another by the Chinese chairman, but we don't see any official documents signed as a result of the meeting, and we don't know whether there will be any bilateral agreements signed. It is expected to be about 10 agreements to be signed for different sectors of the economy. We haven't seen their names, let alone their content. We don't know what they were about, but what can we tell by the information we're already having? For Ukraine, this visit is negative. The question is to what extent it is negative. I'll explain why. Because first of all, it has already happened. It has the highest diplomatic status for the visits of international leaders, and we see that China will take no steps to isolate Russia on an international level. China is insensitive to Putin's toxicity even after the issue of the arrest order by the International Criminal Court in relation to Putin. We see that China has not reacted in no way to this order, let alone in a way that we would like to. And China said that International Criminal Court should review its position and provide objective statement, objective resolution. It means that China is insensitive to such actions because the award of International Criminal Court, it was undertaken due to the war crimes, due to deportation of Ukrainian children to Russian Federation. And the position of China says they are insensitive to war crimes, including those that were happening in Ukrainian cities. And we mentioned it during previous briefings, and we see they're insensitive to this issue too. And secondly, we have to understand that after this visit, the technological, economic, and diplomatic relations between China and Russia will be reinforced. If we look at the negotiations going on in Kremlin right now, there are negotiations going on between the governments in broad format and in short format, and we may analyze the participants of those negotiations. We see that the representatives of defense industry complex, from airspace industry, energy, and military and technical cooperation industries. So it means that the negotiations will be about those topics in these areas, and the bilateral agreements will be signed in those areas. So this is what Russia needs: military industrial complex, defense complex, airspace industry, technologies that will ensure that Russian economy will be able to function more efficiently, even though they will be forced to sell energy carriers at discounted price to China. Still, their economy will be more resilient to sanctions and outer irritators. The third aspect that we see, there are efforts from the Chinese side to get Ukrainian party engaged to the so-called peace negotiations. It was visible from the rhetorics of Chinese leaders, even before the visit itself, during the visit itself, and moreover, there are some indicators that there was pressure on the Ukrainian diplomacy by the Chinese side. Chinese were trying to find out to what extent is Ukraine ready for such negotiations, and it was also happening on the expert level. There were discussions with Chinese experts who are directly affiliated with the Chinese government, including Ministry of Defense and Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and we've seen the attempts by Chinese, they were trying to find out whether Ukraine is ready for peace negotiations, obviously based on Russian conditions. And they were trying to convince us that it's necessary, and our arguments that there are no prerequisites for such peace negotiations because Russia does not refuse its strategic tasks of eradicating Ukrainian identity. Russian Federation is not going to leave Ukrainian territories, because even if the negotiations would take place and there would be a ceasefire agreement signed, it will not result in peace, but rather in staying Russia in Ukrainian territory. So those arguments didn't work for Chinese side, and they were trying to push those so-called peace negotiations ahead. I don't know whether there will be a telephone call between Zelensky and Xi Jinping, because there was no official confirmation of that so far, and it will depend to much extent whether Ukraine will be ready to such so-called peace negotiations. Now it's questioned whether China will provide any military and technical support to Russian Federation. Well, we were negotiating with the Chinese experts. It was like tens of them. The dominating opinion is that it's less likely. However, we cannot exclude that possibility, because there is a number of arguments in favor of China being able to make the decisions. So Ukraine should consider all the scenarios being developed, and including the worst case scenario, and Ukraine cannot afford be illusioned and then get some unpleasant surprise. So any development of the situation should be considered by Ukraine, and Ukraine should be preparing for that and take some preventive measures in that regard. For the time being, that's it. Mr. Yurii, last time we were talking, all the experts that were present in this studio agreed that now China is facing a choice. First of all, it's the politics and influence, and on the other hand, it's money, economy, and development of economy. So does this visit say that China already made their choice, and their choice is not in favor of economy and development, but rather in favor of politics and influence? Well, we don't see such results so far. Even if there will be any documents published today or tomorrow, they will not contain anything that would say that China is ready to hand any weapons or equipment to Russia. Those documents will rather say that they jointly try to fight world terrorism, world hegemony, third forces, expansion of the military political alliances, and so on and so forth. Those will be the narratives such documents would contain, and cooperation of China and Russia is not aimed at third parties, and it's only fulfilled for the joint development and international security. However, something that will not be announced if China has already made such a decision, it's not necessary to announce it. They would rather make it in a clandestine manner through third countries, reducing supplies by method of cutting salami, so to say. And so we don't know whether this decision is already taken. For the time being, we don't see it in our analytical center. We try to verify that information, but it's extremely important so far. We see the indicators that such decision may be taken with certain degree of probability, not so high probability, but we don't see it has been already taken, but to make sure we have to see some China manufactured weapons on the battlefield. So I think really such discussion in Chinese government between ideological matters and economic issues, it exists. It's difficult to say which party will win now. Mr. Yurii, is the statement actual that is being discussed by many experts who say that the most favorable strategy, most advantageous strategy for China is to make this conflict frozen, to extend it? Do you agree with this statement? I think that this statement makes sense. It may exist because we tried to verify those statements about a year ago, and we were doing it within the year that passed with a number of different studies, number of different instruments, and I can say that we really confirmed that the worst case scenario for China is the military victory of Ukraine. It's very close to reality, but if we consider the best case scenario, which is the military victory of Russian Federation and preservation of status quo, but the military victory of Russian Federation is very unlikely, and we see it even upon discussions with Chinese experts within the year that has passed. We had several rounds of such negotiations with them, and if in the beginning of the year they were sure about Russians' victory, and then when Ukraine received HIMARS in the middle of the year, they already didn't know how the situation would develop. So in the end of 2022, they were convinced that Ukraine was winning. So China sees the victory of Russian Federation as unlikely or very less likely, but their ability to stay in the territories that they already captured with high intensity battles, but without broad scale offensive, that would be absolutely acceptable situation for China, even regardless that China talks about some peace negotiations. We understand that so-called peace negotiations, they may not result in peace, in fact. So besides, we understand that for China it's interesting, it's important that United States reinforce their allies in the Asia-Pacific region, such as Australia, Japan, Taiwan, and currently the defense complex of the United States is engaged in sending aid and support to Ukraine. So we think that for China it's important that USA is engaged with those issues and doesn't arm their allies surrounding China, because they're preparing for confrontation too. We have questions on the floor, please. Good afternoon, Nadia Yurchenko, Ukrinform. I have two questions. One is about the past, one is about the future. It's a known fact that in China there were maps issued with the Chinese names of the Russian territories, specifically in Siberia. What may it mean? How should we evaluate this fact on the background of these friendly negotiations between China and Russia? Does it tell us about some territorial claims? And you also said that Ukraine should be prepared to all scenarios, including the worst case scenario. But in your opinion, what can Ukraine do based on what you said to switch the situation to its advantage? According to the territorial claims, we see no indicators for the time being, whether big or small, if China is ready to claim some territories in Russia, to take away some historic Chinese lands. It's a very serious illusion that was existing in the expert media and scientific community. That's the overestimation of the capabilities of China and underestimation of capabilities of Russia in respect of China. As to those maps you mentioned, I've seen those news too. There are two names. One name is in Russian and another name in brackets is in Chinese. So I don't know to what extent it is in accord with the current approach of the Chinese side. I don't know how they specified those names before, but I think is their overall general approach. So I don't think that it may result in any consequences, honestly. As to what Ukraine could do to prevent the worst case scenario, obviously Ukrainian diplomacy and Ukraine, in fact, we don't have any instruments for influence on China. China does not depend critically on Ukraine in no matters, in either agricultural products or anything. We are less than 1% in Chinese trend. China covers its food security for 95% in fact. So even regardless that Ukraine is one of the major suppliers of agricultural products to China, its share is still very small. And Russia is way more important for China in terms of geopolitics, and what Ukraine could do regardless of the restrictions that we have, the restricted economic and diplomatic capabilities. I think that regardless that Ukrainian diplomacy has very little weight in this process, Washington's diplomacy is very important, and Brussels' diplomacy and diplomacy of European countries is very important in China. And it has already started. Washington already stated that should China provide weapons to Russian Federation, the consequences will be serious. There will be serious sanctions imposed, and technological and economic ties will be cut with China. It means that Brussels and Washington already started this information policy for holding China back and explaining them that there will be a problematic consequences for China, and Brussels and Washington already stated about that. And I think it would be good if every member of European Union and NATO states it by themselves and keeps reiterating their stance during their every meeting. This message should be very powerful and persistent, and I think that it would be not only good to make those statements, but also to develop a plan of actions in case China starts providing military support to Russia, and to communicate that plan to Chinese side and to publish it, because China has to clearly understand that it would not only be the concerns in the capitals, but that will result in cut of ties, in freezing of joint projects and freezing of serious amounts of money. Very powerful signal for Chinese side would be to start, if European Union and NATO announce the process for joining Ukraine to those organizations, which would mean that the West sees Ukraine as a part of West rather than a buffer zone, as it is seen by China, that Ukraine is a part of the West, and any actions against Ukraine will be seen as actions against the West. That would be a very serious argument for China to abstain from providing such military aid and support. Mr. Yurii, we have more questions in the studio.
Thank you very much, Mr. Yurii. Lorenzo Cremonesi for Corriere della Sera. As you rightly stated, it is a perception from Kyiv, from all the Western press, is of course your major worry is the case that at one point China would provide arms to Russia. on this respect, we saw two slightly different approach from Kyiv and Washington, and also from Kyiv and the European community. I had an interview a few days ago with Zelensky, and not only him, with Vereshchuk yesterday, and they more or less say the same. They try to show attention to the 12 points of the peace process proposal by Xi Jinping, by China, while both Europe and the States were very critical from the beginning, almost threatening China if China would have sent a weapon. So do you see that on this domain there are some differences? I mean, maybe Ukraine, because it's particularly worried of this possibility of China sending weapons, is very careful in criticizing China, while the states are more confrontational. And maybe this confrontation, this attitude, is a bit worrying also for Kyiv. Zelensky doesn't want a confrontation between China and Ukraine today, because in this confrontation, China can decide yes to send weapons to Moscow. What do you think?
I think that the perception of Ukraine in China was very different in time and in different bodies of government. From the beginning of the full-scale war, the perception of China in Ukrainian government, there were some high expectations about what China can do for Ukraine, that they can become one of the guarantors of the Ukrainian security, that they may press on Russia. When I was analyzing this situation, there were about 7 tasks that Ukrainian diplomacy was trying to achieve from China, and they practically did not achieve any. And for the time being, I think that those expectations, that I would rather call illusions, they are now way reduced, and Ukrainian side is more realistic now in what they can expect from China regarding the fact that Ukraine doesn't want to quarrel with China. Do not antagonize the dragon. If you are fighting a bear, for Ukraine it doesn't make sense to get an additional very powerful enemy which China may represent. We understand that the capabilities of Chinese industry, Chinese military-industrial complex are very serious, and inclusion of China in this process will create a number of humongous threats for Ukraine. That's why Ukrainian diplomacy, understanding that they would not be able to achieve those tasks that they set in the very beginning in front of them, their main task is not to deteriorate their relations with the Chinese side. So all the communications from Ukrainian side, they were going on in a peaceful manner. China was never criticized. So what sense does it make to criticize China if they don't change their opinion on Russian-Ukrainian war, and it may even become worse? That's why Ukrainian side never called Chinese position pro-Russian. They were calling it neutral, and they were emphasizing on the importance of China's role in the world, on the Ukrainian and China strategic relations, so creating such a positive background of relations. So I agree with you that Ukraine is kind of afraid of this inclusion of China in this process of Russian side. So such approaches, they are purposeful and they are justified, in my opinion. There is an additional question, please.
Sorry, but okay, we agree. I think we have the same perception. But can I ask you, the fact that Xi Jinping arrives for a strong 3 days. It's a long visit in Moscow. Few days, 3 or 4 days after the International Tribunal decision. We know this visit had been planned since a long time, but do you see that it's also a slap against Europe in a way? Because this tribunal is not recognized by the Americans, by the way, as is not by China. But for Europe, it's very important. Europe is not a big military factor, but it has this idea of democracy, law, respecting of rules. And the tribunal, in a way, is a mirror of the European policy. We cannot give you too many weapons, but we give you legitimacy, we give you political support, we give you the stamp of democracy or not, of being a democratic actor or not. So the fact that in spite of the decision, without even naming the decision, they didn't mention never Putin or Xi Jinping, it's a slap against Europe. Thank you.
I'll try to make it short. The American party keeps saying for a long time that the global aim of China is to undermine the global order, which is based on the international law, and this is the demonstration how China is undermining this international law, because this International Criminal Court is absolutely legitimate institution, and their resolution is based on evidences, on serious investigations. But we're seeing now that Chinese side doesn't see it as legitimate, and they do not comply with that resolution. It was happening before, for example, when China claimed their territories in the South China Sea, when China refused to comply with the resolution of International Criminal Court regarding China's territorial claims. So this is really what's happening, and I think this is what demonstrates that China, unfortunately, not only demonstrates the support to Russian Federation, but also they ignore the generally accepted international rules and standards, thus trying to force other countries to ignore them or to make an example that with the rule of force they may not comply with international law and so on. Mr. Yurii, last question to wrap it up. We're all talking that the conversation between Xi Jinping and our President Zelensky is possible. If it happens, what do you think? Will this conversation be about the peace plan of China, and does this conversation has a plan to change the situation? Well, I don't think that there will be a chance to change the situation dramatically. I don't think that there will be any breakthroughs for Ukrainian side, because as I already said, China tries to develop the role of Russian Federation in their geopolitics. But if this conversation does take place, it will be positive for Ukraine, because I remember one of the discussions in an Israeli analytics center, when ex-director of Israeli intelligence Mossad, he said that it's better to talk badly than to fight good, and it will reduce the possibility that China would hand any weapons to Russian Federation. The negotiations would not switch the Chinese position to one more favorable for Ukraine, but they will reduce the degree of this pro-Russian Chinese policy. The president of Ukraine Volodymyr Zelensky is not very influential leader. He is capable of convincing, he is very charismatic, he can convince the governments of other countries, but those arguments would not work for a Russian side, and in the same way they would not work on Chinese, because as I said, China is very insensitive to some issues related to violation of international law or territorial integrity, even regardless their rhetorics, or to some issues related to destruction of the whole cities, of the work or related to war crimes, so there will be no serious breakthroughs. However, it's better than nothing anyway. What the parties can achieve, usually it happens within about 30 minutes or 1 hour. It's a very short period of time. There are greetings, exchange with introduction speeches, and communication of their positions. So during such negotiations, usually there are very little opportunities for reaction to your counterpart's position, for an attempt to convince them. So Ukrainian party will read the position of the Ukrainian side, how we see the resolution of the Russian-Ukrainian war based on the international law, and Chinese side would probably cite their position, which contains those 12 articles. So those are the expectations, very careful and restrained. Thank you for this conversation. I'm reminding you, joining us was Yurii Poita, head of the Asia-Pacific section at the Center for Army Conversion and Disarmament Studies. Our team is working on the schedule for tomorrow, so bear with us to work together for our victory, and glory to Ukraine.